If the Lord didn't want us to take as much as we could get, he preached, he wouldn't have given us two good hands to take it with. And the others murmured, Amen. Major Major's father had a Calvinist's faith in predestination, and could perceive distinctly how every one's misfortunes but his own were expressions of God's will. He smoked cigarettes and drank whiskey, and he thrived on good wit and stimulating intellectual conversation, particularly his own, when he was lying about his age, or telling that good one about God and his wife's difficulties in delivering Major Major. The good one about God and his wife's difficulties had to do with the fact that it had taken God only 6 days to produce the whole world, whereas his wife had spent a full day and a half in labor just to produce Major Major. A lesser man might have wavered that day in the hospital corridor. A weaker man might have compromised on such excellent substitutes as drum major, minor major, sergeant major, or C-sharp major. But Major Major's father had waited 14 years for just such an opportunity, and he was not a person to waste it. Major Major's father had a good joke about opportunity. Opportunity only knocks once in this world, he would say. Major Major's father repeated this good joke at every opportunity. Being born with a sickly resemblance to Henry Fonda was the first of a long series of practical jokes of which destiny was to make Major Major the unhappy victim throughout his joyless life. Being born Major 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 was the second. The fact that he had been born Major 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 was a secret known only to his father. Not until Major Major was enrolling in kindergarten was the discovery of his real name made, and then the effects were disastrous. The news killed his mother, who just lost her will to live and wasted away and died, which was just fine with his father, who had decided to marry the bad-tempered girl at the A&P if he had to, and who had not been optimistic about his chances of getting his wife off the land without paying her some money or flogging her. On Major Major himself, the consequences were only slightly less severe. It was a harsh and stunning realization that was forced upon him at so tender an age, the realization that he was not, as he had always been led to believe, Caleb Major, but instead was some total stranger named Major Major Major, about whom he knew absolutely nothing, and about whom nobody else had ever heard before. What playmates he had withdrew from him and never returned, disposed as they were to distrust all strangers, especially one who had already deceived them by pretending to be someone they had known for years. Nobody would have anything to do with him. He began to drop things and to trip. He had a shy and hopeful manner in each new contact, and he was always disappointed, because he needed a friend so desperately he never found one. He grew awkwardly into a tall, strange, dreamy boy with fragile eyes and a very delicate mouth, whose tentative, groping smile collapsed instantly into hurt disorder at every fresh rebuff. He was polite to his elders, who disliked him. Whatever his elders told him to do, he did. They told him to look before he leaped, and he always looked before he leaped. They told him never to put off until the next day what he could do the day before, and he never did. He was told to honor his father and his mother, and he honored his father and his mother. He was told that he should not kill, and he did not kill until he got into the army. Then he was told to kill, and he killed. He turned the other cheek on every occasion, and always did unto others exactly as he would have had others do unto him. When he gave to charity, his left hand never knew what his right hand was doing. He never once took the name of the Lord his God in vain, committed adultery, or coveted his neighbor's ass. In fact, he loved his neighbor and never even bore false witness against him. Major Major's elders disliked him because he was such a flagrant nonconformist. Since he had nothing better to do well in, he did well in school. At the State University, he took his studies so seriously that he was suspected by the homosexuals of being a communist and suspected by the communists of being a homosexual. He majored in English history, which was a mistake. English history, roared the silver-maned senior senator from his state indignantly. What's the matter with American history? American history is as good as any history in the world. Major Major switched immediately to American literature, but not before the FBI had opened a file on him. There were 6 people and a Scotch terrier inhabiting the remote farmhouse Major Major called home, and 5 of them and the Scotch terrier turned out to be agents for the FBI. Soon they had enough derogatory information on Major Major to do whatever they wanted to with him. The only thing they could find to do with him, however, was take him into the Army as a private and make him a major 4 days later so that congressmen with nothing else on their minds could go trotting back and forth through the streets of Washington, D.C., chanting, "Who promoted Major Major? Who promoted Major Major?" Actually, Major Major had been promoted by an IBM machine with a sense of humor almost as keen as his father's. When war broke out, he was still docile and compliant. They told him to enlist, and he enlisted. They told him to apply for aviation cadet training, and he applied for aviation cadet training. And the very next night, found himself standing barefoot in icy mud at 3 o'clock in the morning before a tough and belligerent sergeant from the Southwest, who told them he could beat hell out of any man in his outfit and was ready to prove it. The recruits in his squadron had all been shaken roughly awake only minutes before by the sergeant's corporals, and told to assemble in front of the administration tent. It was still raining on Major Major. They fell into ranks in the civilian clothes they had brought into the Army with them 3 days before. Those who had lingered to put shoes and socks on were sent back to their cold, wet, dark tents to remove them. And they were all barefoot in the mud as the sergeant ran his stony eyes over the faces and told them he could beat hell out of any man in his outfit. No one was inclined to dispute him. Major Major's unexpected promotion to major the next day plunged the belligerent sergeant into a bottomless gloom, for he was no longer able to boast that he could beat hell out of any man in his outfit. He brooded for hours in his tent like Saul, receiving no visitors, while his elite guard of corporals stood discouraged watch outside. At 3 o'clock in the morning, he found his solution, and Major Major and the other recruits were again shaken roughly awake and ordered to assemble barefoot in the drizzly glare at the administration tent, where the sergeant was already waiting, his fists clenched on his hips cockily, so eager to speak that he could hardly wait for them to arrive. "Me and Major Major," he boasted in the same tough, clipped tones of the night before, "can beat hell out of any man in my outfit." The officers on the base took action on the Major Major problem later that day. How could they cope with a major like Major Major? To demean him personally would be to demean all other officers of equal or lesser rank. To treat him with courtesy, on the other hand, was unthinkable. Fortunately, Major Major had applied for aviation cadet training. Orders transferring him away were sent to the mimeograph room late in the afternoon, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, Major Major was again shaken roughly awake, bidden Godspeed by the sergeant, and placed aboard a plane heading west. Lieutenant Scheisskopf turned white as a sheet when Major Major reported to him in California with bare feet and mud-caked toes. Major Major had taken it for granted that he was being shaken roughly awake again to stand barefoot in the mud, and had left his shoes and socks in the tent. The civilian clothing in which he reported for duty to Lieutenant Scheisskopf was rumpled and dirty. Lieutenant Scheisskopf, who had not yet made his reputation as a parader, shuddered violently at the picture Major Major would make marching barefoot in his squadron that coming Sunday. "Go to the hospital, quickly," he mumbled, when he had recovered sufficiently to speak, "and tell them you're sick. Stay there until your allowance for uniforms catches up with you, and you have some money to buy some clothes, and some shoes. Buy some shoes." "Yes, sir." "I don't think you have to call me sir, Lieutenant Scheisskopf pointed out. "You outrank me." "Yes, sir. I may outrank you, sir, but you're still my commanding officer." "Yes, sir, that's right," Lieutenant Scheisskopf agreed. "You may outrank me, sir, but I'm still your commanding officer. So you better do what I tell you, sir, or you'll get into trouble. Go to the hospital and tell them you're sick, sir. Stay there until your uniform allowance catches up with you and you have some money to buy some uniforms." "Yes, sir." "And some shoes, sir. Buy some shoes the first chance you get, sir." "Yes, sir, I will, sir." "Thank you, sir." Life in cadet school for Major Major was no different than life had been for him all along. Whoever he was with always wanted him to be with someone else. His instructors gave him preferred treatment at every stage in order to push him along quickly and be rid of him. In almost no time, he had his pilot's wings and found himself overseas, where things began suddenly to improve. All his life, Major Major had longed for but one thing, to be absorbed. And in Pianosa, for a while, he finally was. Rank meant little to the men on combat duty, and relations between officers and enlisted men were relaxed and informal. Men whose names he didn't even know said hi and invited him to go swimming or play basketball. His ripest hours were spent in the day-long basketball games no one gave a damn about winning. Score was never kept, and the number of players might vary from 1 to 35. Major Major had never played basketball or any other game before, but his great bobbing height and rapturous enthusiasm helped make up for his innate clumsiness and lack of experience. Major Major found true happiness there on the lopsided basketball court with the officers and enlisted men who were almost his friends. If there were no winners, there were no losers, and Major Major enjoyed every gambolling moment right up till the day Colonel Cathcart roared up in his jeep after Major Duluth was killed and made it impossible for him ever to enjoy playing basketball there again. "You're the new squadron commander," Colonel Cathcart had shouted rudely across the railroad ditch to him. "But don't think it means anything, because it doesn't. All it means is that you're the new squadron commander." Colonel Cathcart had nursed an implacable grudge against Major Major for a long time. A superfluous major on his rolls meant an untidy table of organization, and gave ammunition to the men at 27th Air Force Headquarters, who Colonel Cathcart was positive were his enemies and rivals. Colonel Cathcart had been praying for just some stroke of good luck like Major Duluth's death. He had been plagued by one extra major. He now had an opening for one major. He appointed Major Major squadron commander and roared away in his jeep as abruptly as he had come. For Major Major, it meant the end of the game. His face flushed with discomfort, and he was rooted to the spot in disbelief as the rain clouds gathered above him again. When he turned to his teammates, he encountered a reef of curious, reflective faces, all gazing at him woodenly with morose and inscrutable animosity. He shivered with shame. When the game resumed, it was not good any longer. When he dribbled, no one tried to stop him. When he called for a pass, whoever had the ball passed it. And when he missed a basket, no one raced him for the rebound. The only voice was his own. The next day was the same, and the day after that, he did not come back. Almost on cue, everyone in the squadron stopped talking to him and started staring at him. He walked through life self-consciously, with downcast eyes and burning cheeks, the object of contempt, envy, suspicion, resentment, and malicious innuendo everywhere he went. People who had hardly noticed his resemblance to Henry Fonda before now never ceased discussing it, and there were even those who hinted sinisterly that Major Major had been elevated to squadron commander because he resembled Henry Fonda. Captain Black, who had aspired to the position himself, maintained that Major Major really was Henry Fonda, but was too chicken-shit to admit it. Major Major floundered bewilderedly from one embarrassing catastrophe to another. Without consulting him, Sergeant Towser had his belongings moved into the roomy trailer Major Duluth had occupied alone, and when Major Major came rushing breathlessly into the orderly room to report the theft of his things, the young corporal there scared him half out of his wits by leaping to his feet and shouting, "Attention!" the moment he appeared. Major Major snapped to attention with all the rest in the orderly room, wondering what important personage had entered behind him. Minutes passed in rigid silence, and the whole lot of them might have stood there at attention till doomsday if Major Danby had not dropped by from group to congratulate Major Major 20 minutes later and put them all at ease. Major Major fared even more lamentably at the mess hall, where Milo, his face fluttery with smiles, was waiting to usher him proudly to a small table he had set up in front and decorated with an embroidered tablecloth and a nosegay of posies in a pink cut-glass vase. Major Major hung back with horror, but he was not bold enough to resist with all the others watching. Even Havermeyer had lifted his head from his plate to gape at him with his heavy, pendulous jaw. Major Major submitted meekly to Milo's tugging and cowered in disgrace at his private table throughout the whole meal. The food was ashes in his mouth, but he swallowed every mouthful rather than risk offending any of the men connected with its preparation. Alone with Milo later, Major Major felt protest stir for the first time and said he would prefer to continue eating with the other officers. Milo told him it wouldn't work. "I don't see what there is to work," Major Major argued. "Nothing ever happened before. You were never the squadron commander before." "Major Duluth was the squadron commander, and he always ate at the same table with the rest of the men." "It was different with Major Duluth, sir." "In what way was it different with Major Duluth?" "I wish you wouldn't ask me that, sir," said Milo. "Is it because I look like Henry Fonda?" Major Major mustered the courage to demand. Some people say you are Henry Fonda, Milo answered. Well, I'm not Henry Fonda, Major exclaimed in a voice quavering with exasperation, and I don't look the least bit like him. And even if I do look like Henry Fonda, what difference does that make? It doesn't make any difference. That's what I'm trying to tell you, sir. It's just not the same with you as it was with Major Duluth. And it just wasn't the same. For when Major at the next meal stepped from the food counter to sit with the others at the regular tables, he was frozen in his tracks by the impenetrable wall of antagonism thrown up by their faces, and stood petrified with his tray quivering in his hands until Milo glided forward wordlessly to rescue him by leading him tamely to his private table. Major gave up after that, and always ate at his table alone with his back to the others. He was certain they resented him because he seemed too good to eat with them now that he was squadron commander. There was never any conversation in the mess tent when Major was present. He was conscious that other officers tried to avoid eating at the same time, and everyone was greatly relieved when he stopped coming there altogether and began taking his meals in his trailer. Major began forging Washington Irving's name to official documents the day after the first CID man showed up to interrogate him about somebody at the hospital who had been doing it and gave him the idea. He had been bored and dissatisfied in his new position. He had been made squadron commander, but had no idea what he was supposed to do as squadron commander, unless all he was supposed to do was forge Washington Irving's name to official documents and listen to the isolated clinks and thumps of Major de Coverley's horseshoes falling to the ground outside the window of his small office in the rear of the orderly room tent. He was hounded incessantly by an impression of vital duties left unfulfilled, and waited in vain for his responsibilities to overtake him. He seldom went out unless it was absolutely necessary, for he could not get used to being stared at. Occasionally, the monotony was broken by some officer or enlisted man Sergeant Towser referred to him on some matter that Major was unable to cope with, and referred right back to Sergeant Towser for sensible disposition. Whatever he was supposed to get done as squadron commander apparently was getting done without any assistance from him. He grew moody and depressed. At times, he thought seriously of going with all his sorrows to see the chaplain, but the chaplain seemed so overburdened with miseries of his own that Major shrank from adding to his troubles. Besides, he was not quite sure if chaplains were for squadron commanders. He had never been quite sure about Major de Coverley either, who, when he was not away renting apartments or kidnapping foreign laborers, had nothing more pressing to do than pitch horseshoes. Major often paid strict attention to the horseshoes falling softly against the earth or riding down around the small steel pegs in the ground. He peeked out at Major de Coverley for hours and marveled that someone so august had nothing more important to do. He was often tempted to join Major de Coverley, but pitching horseshoes all day long seemed almost as dull as signing Major to official documents, and Major de Coverley's countenance was so forbidding that Major was in awe of approaching him. Major wondered about his relationship to Major de Coverley and about Major de Coverley's relationship to him. He knew that Major de Coverley was his executive officer, but he did not know what that meant, and he could not decide whether in Major de Coverley he was blessed with a lenient superior or cursed with a delinquent subordinate. He did not want to ask Sergeant Towser, of whom he was secretly afraid, and there was no one else he could ask, least of all Major de Coverley. Few people ever dared approach Major de Coverley about anything, and the only officer foolish enough to pitch one of his horseshoes was stricken the very next day with the worst case of pianosin crud that Gus or Wes or even Doc Danica had ever seen or even heard about. Everyone was positive the disease had been inflicted upon the poor officer in retribution by Major de Coverley, although no one was sure how. Most of the official documents that came to Major's desk did not concern him at all. The vast majority consisted of allusions to prior communications, which Major had never seen or heard of. There was never any need to look them up, for the instructions were invariably to disregard. In the space of a single productive minute, therefore, he might endorse 20 separate documents, each advising him to pay absolutely no attention to any of the others. From General Peckham's office on the mainland came prolix bulletins each day headed by such cheery homilies as procrastination is the thief of time and cleanliness is next to godliness. General Peckham's communication about cleanliness and procrastination made Major feel like a filthy procrastinator, and he always got those out of the way as quickly as he could. The only official documents that interested him were those occasional ones pertaining to the unfortunate second lieutenant who had been killed on the mission over Orvieto less than 2 hours after he arrived on Pianosa, and whose partly unpacked belongings were still in Yossarian's tent. Since the unfortunate lieutenant had reported to the operations tent instead of to the orderly room, Sergeant Towser had decided that it would be safest to report him as never having reported to the squadron at all, and the occasional documents relating to him dealt with the fact that he seemed to have vanished into thin air, which in one way was exactly what did happen to him. In the long run, Major was grateful for the official documents that came to his desk, for sitting in his office signing them all day long was a lot better than sitting in his office all day long not signing them. They gave him something to do. Inevitably, every document he signed came back with a fresh page added for a new signature by him after intervals of from 2 to 10 days. They were always much thicker than formerly, for in between the sheet bearing his last endorsement and the sheet added for his new endorsement were the sheets bearing the most recent endorsements of all the other officers in scattered locations who were also occupied in signing their names to that same official document. Major grew despondent as he watched simple communications swell prodigiously into huge manuscripts. No matter how many times he signed one, it always came back for still another signature, and he began to despair of ever being free of any of them. One day, it was the day after the CID man's first visit, Major signed Washington Irving's name to one of the documents instead of his own, just to see how it would feel. He liked it. He liked it so much that for the rest of that afternoon he did the same with all the official documents. It was an act of impulsive frivolity and rebellion, for which he knew afterward he would be punished severely. The next morning he entered his office in trepidation and waited to see what would happen. Nothing happened. He had sinned, and it was good, for none of the documents to which he had signed Washington Irving's name ever came back. Here at last was progress, and Major threw himself into his new career with uninhibited gusto. Signing Washington Irving's name to official documents was not much of a career, perhaps, but it was less monotonous than signing Major. When Washington Irving did grow monotonous, he could reverse the order and sign Irving Washington until that grew monotonous. And he was getting something done, for none of the documents signed with either of these names ever came back to the squadron. What did come back eventually was a second CID man masquerading as a pilot. The men knew he was a CID man because he confided to them he was and urged each of them not to reveal his true identity to any of the other men to whom he had already confided that he was a CID man. "You're the only one in the squadron who knows I'm a CID man," he confided to Major, "and it's absolutely essential that it remain a secret so that my efficiency won't be impaired. Do you understand? Sergeant Towser knows. Yes, I know. I had to tell him in order to get to see you. But I know he won't tell a soul under any circumstances." "He told me," said Major. "He told me there was a CID man outside to see me." "That bastard, I'll have to throw a security check on him. I wouldn't leave any top-secret documents lying around here if I were you, at least not until I make my report." "I don't get any top-secret documents," said Major. "That's the kind I mean. Lock them in your cabinet where Sergeant Towser can't get his hands on them." "Sergeant Towser has the only key to the cabinet." "I'm afraid we're wasting time," said the second CID man rather stiffly. He was a brisk, pudgy, high-strung person whose movements were swift and certain. He took a number of photostats out of a large red expansion envelope he had been hiding conspicuously beneath a leather flight jacket painted garishly with pictures of airplanes flying through orange bursts of flak, and with orderly rows of little bombs signifying 55 combat missions flown. "Have you ever seen any of these?" Major looked with a blank expression at copies of personal correspondence from the hospital on which the censoring officer had written Washington Irving or Irving Washington. "No? How about these?" Major Major gazed next at copies of official documents addressed to him, to which he had been signing the same signatures. No. Is the man who signed these names in your squadron? Which one? There are 2 names here. Either one. We figure that Washington Irving and Irving Washington are one man, and that he's using 2 names just to throw us off the track. That's done very often, you know. I don't think there's a man with either of those names in my squadron. A look of disappointment crossed the second CID man's face. He's a lot cleverer than we thought, he observed. He's using a 3rd name and posing as someone else. And I think I know what the 3rd name is. With excitement and inspiration, he held another photostat out for Major Major to study. How about this? Major Major bent forward slightly and saw a copy of the piece of V-mail from which Yossarian had blacked out everything but the name Mary, and on which he had written, I yearn for you tragically, A.T. Tapman, Chaplain, U.S. Army. Major Major shook his head. I've never seen it before. Do you know who A.T. Tapman is? He's the group chaplain. That locks it up, said the second CID man. Washington Irving is the group chaplain. Major Major felt a twinge of alarm. A.T. Tapman is the group chaplain, he corrected. Are you sure? Yes. Why should the group chaplain write this on a letter? Perhaps somebody else wrote it and forged his name. Why should somebody want to forge the group chaplain's name? To escape detection. You may be right, the second CID man decided after an instant's hesitation, and smacked his lips crisply. Maybe we're confronted with a gang, with 2 men working together who just happen to have opposite names. Yes, I'm sure that's it. One of them here in the squadron, one of them up at the hospital, and one of them with the chaplain. That makes 3 men, doesn't it? Are you absolutely sure you never saw any of these official documents before? I would have signed them if I had. With whose name? Asked the second CID man cunningly. Yours or Washington Irving's? With my own name, Major Major told him. I don't even know Washington Irving's name. The second CID man broke into a smile. Major, I'm glad you're in the clear. It means we'll be able to work together, and I'm going to need every man I can get. Somewhere in the European theater of operations is a man who's getting his hands on communications addressed to you. Have you any idea who it can be? No. Well, I have a pretty good idea, said the second CID man, and leaned forward to whisper confidentially. That bastard Towser. Why else would he go around shooting his mouth off about me? Now you keep your eyes open and let me know the minute you hear anyone even talking about Washington Irving. I'll throw a security check on the chaplain and everyone else around here. The moment he was gone, the first CID man jumped into Major Major's office through the window and wanted to know who the second CID man was. Major Major barely recognized him. He was a CID man, Major Major told him. Like hell he was, said the first CID man. I'm the CID man around here. Major Major barely recognized him because he was wearing a faded maroon corduroy bathrobe with open seams under both arms, linty flannel pajamas, and worn house slippers with one flapping sole. This was regulation hospital dress, Major Major recalled. The man had added about 20 pounds and seemed bursting with good health. I'm really a very sick man, he whined. I caught cold in the hospital from a fighter pilot and came down with a very serious case of pneumonia. I'm very sorry, Major Major said. A lot of good that does me, the CID man sniveled. I don't want your sympathy. I just want you to know what I'm going through. I came down to warn you that Washington Irving seems to have shifted his base of operations from the hospital to your squadron. You haven't heard anyone around here talking about Washington Irving, have you? As a matter of fact, I have, Major Major answered. That man who was just in here, he was talking about Washington Irving. Was he really? The first CID man cried with delight. This might be just what we needed to crack the case wide open. You keep him under surveillance 24 hours a day while I rush back to the hospital and write my superiors for further instructions. The CID man jumped out of Major Major's office through the window and was gone. A minute later, the flap separating Major Major's office from the orderly room flew open, and the second CID man was back, puffing frantically in haste. Gasping for breath, he shouted, I just saw a man in red pajamas come jumping out of your window and go running up the road. Didn't you see him? He was here talking to me, Major Major answered. I thought that looked mighty suspicious, a man jumping out the window in red pajamas. The man paced about the small office in vigorous circles. At first I thought it was you, hightailing it from Mexico, but now I see it wasn't you. He didn't say anything about Washington Irving, did he? As a matter of fact, said Major, he did. He did? Cried the second CID man. That's fine. This might be just the break we needed to crack the case wide open. Do you know where we can find him? At the hospital. He's really a very sick man. That's great, exclaimed the second CID man. I'll go right up there after him. It would be best if I went incognito. I'll go explain the situation at the medical tent and have them send me there as a patient. They won't send me to the hospital as a patient unless I'm sick, he reported back to Major. Actually, I am pretty sick. I've been meaning to turn myself in for a checkup, and this will be a good opportunity. I'll go back to the medical tent and tell them I'm sick, and I'll get sent to the hospital that way. Look what they did to me, he reported back to Major with purple gums. His distress was inconsolable. He carried his shoes and socks in his hands, and his toes had been painted with gentian violet solution, too. Who ever heard of a CID man with purple gums? He moaned. He walked away from the orderly room with his head down and tumbled into a slit trench and broke his nose. His temperature was still normal, but Gus and Wes made an exception of him and sent him to the hospital in an ambulance. Major had lied, and it was good. He was not really surprised that it was good, for he had observed that people who did lie were, on the whole, more resourceful and ambitious and successful than people who did not lie. Had he told the truth to the second CID man, he would have found himself in trouble. Instead, he had lied, and he was free to continue his work. He became more circumspect in his work as a result of the visit from the second CID man. He did all his signing with his left hand, and only while wearing the dark glasses and false mustache he had used unsuccessfully to help him begin playing basketball again. As an additional precaution, he made a happy switch from Washington Irving to John Milton. John Milton was supple and concise. Like Washington Irving, he could be reversed with good effect whenever he grew monotonous. Furthermore, he enabled Major to double his output, for John Milton was so much shorter than either his own name or Washington Irving's, and took so much less time to write. John Milton proved fruitful in still one more respect. He was versatile, and Major soon found himself incorporating the signature in fragments of imaginary dialogues. Thus, typical endorsements on the official documents might read, John, Milton is a sadist. Have you seen Milton, John? One signature, of which he was especially proud, read, Is anybody in the John, Milton? John Milton threw open whole new vistas, filled with charming, inexhaustible possibilities that promised to ward off monotony forever. Major went back to Washington Irving when John Milton grew monotonous. Major had bought the dark glasses and false mustache in Rome in a final, futile attempt to save himself from the swampy degradation into which he was steadily sinking. First, there had been the awful humiliation of the great loyalty oath crusade, when not one of the 30 or 40 people circulating competitive loyalty oaths would even allow him to sign. Then, just when that was blowing over, there was the matter of Clevenger's plane disappearing so mysteriously in thin air with every member of the crew, and blame for the strange mishap centering balefully on him, because he had never signed any of the loyalty oaths. The dark glasses had large magenta rims. The false black mustache was a flamboyant organ grinder's, and he wore them both to the basketball game one day when he felt he could endure his loneliness no longer. He affected an air of jaunty familiarity as he sauntered to the court and prayed silently that he would not be recognized. The others pretended not to recognize him, and he began to have fun. Just as he finished congratulating himself on his innocent ruse, he was bumped hard by one of his opponents and knocked to his knees. Soon he was bumped hard again, and it dawned on him that they did recognize him, and that they were using his disguise as a license to elbow, trip, and maul him. They did not want him at all. And just as he did realize this, the players on his team fused instinctively with the players on the other team into a single, howling, bloodthirsty mob that descended upon him from all sides with foul curses and swinging fists. They knocked him to the ground, kicked him while he was on the ground, attacked him again after he had struggled blindly to his feet. He covered his face with his hands and could not see. They swarmed all over each other in their frenzied compulsion to bludgeon him, kick him, gouge him, trample him. He was pummeled, spinning to the edge of the ditch and sent slithering down on his head and shoulders. At the bottom he found his footing, clambered up the other wall, and staggered away beneath the hail of hoots and stones with which they pelted him until he lurched into shelter around a corner of the orderly room tent. His paramount concern throughout the entire assault was to keep his dark glasses and false mustache in place so that he might continue pretending he was somebody else and be spared the dreadful necessity of having to confront them with his authority. Back in his office, he wept. And when he finished weeping, he washed the blood from his mouth and nose, scrubbed the dirt from the abrasions on his cheek and forehead, and summoned Sergeant Towser. "From now on," he said, "I don't want anyone to come in to see me while I'm here. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," said Sergeant Towser. "Does that include me?" "Yes." "I see. Will that be all?" "Yes." "What shall I say to the people who do come to see you while you're here?" "Tell them I'm in and ask them to wait." "Yes, sir. For how long?" "Until I've left." "And then what shall I do with them?" "I don't care." "May I send them in to see you after you've left?" "Yes." "But you won't be here then, will you?" "No." "Yes, sir. Will that be all?" "Yes." "Yes, sir." "From now on," Major said to the middle-aged enlisted man who took care of his trailer, "I don't want you to come here while I'm here to ask me if there's anything you can do for me. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," said the orderly. "When should I come here to find out if there's anything you want me to do for you?" "When I'm not here." "Yes, sir." "And what should I do?" "Whatever I tell you to." "But you won't be here to tell me, will you?" "No." "Then what should I do?" "Whatever has to be done." "Yes, sir." "That will be all," said Major. "Yes, sir," said the orderly. "Will that be all?" "No," said Major. "Don't come in to clean, either. Don't come in for anything unless you're sure I'm not here." "Yes, sir." "But how can I always be sure?" "If you're not sure, just assume that I am here and go away until you are sure. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry to have to talk to you in this way, but I have to. Goodbye." "Goodbye, sir. And thank you for everything." "Yes, sir." "From now on," Major said to Milo Minderbinder, "I'm not going to come to the mess hall anymore. I'll have all my meals brought to me in my trailer." "I think that's a good idea, sir," Milo answered. "Now I'll be able to serve you special dishes that the others will never know about. I'm sure you'll enjoy them. Colonel Cathcart always does." "I don't want any special dishes. I want exactly what you serve all the other officers. Just have whoever brings it knock once on my door and leave the tray on the step. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," said Milo. "That's very clear. I've got some live Maine lobsters hidden away that I can serve you tonight, with an excellent Roquefort salad and 2 frozen eclairs that were smuggled out of Paris only yesterday, together with an important member of the French underground. Will that do for a start?" "No." "Yes, sir. I understand." For dinner that night, Milo served him broiled Maine lobster with excellent Roquefort salad and 2 frozen eclairs. Major was annoyed. If he sent it back, though, it would only go to waste or to somebody else, and Major had a weakness for broiled lobster. He ate with a guilty conscience. The next day, for lunch, there was Terrapin, Maryland, with a whole quart of Dom Perignon 1937, and Major gulped it down without a thought. After Milo, there remained only the men in the orderly room, and Major avoided them by entering and leaving every time through the dingy celluloid window of his office. The window unbuttoned, and was low and large and easy to jump through from either side. He managed the distance between the orderly room and his trailer by darting around the corner of the tent when the coast was clear, leaping down into the railroad ditch, and dashing along with his head bowed until he attained the sanctuary of the forest. Abreast of his trailer, he left the ditch and wove his way speedily toward home through the dense underbrush, in which the only person he ever encountered was Captain Flume, who, drawn and ghostly, frightened him half to death one twilight by materializing without warning out of a patch of dewberry bushes to complain that Chief White Half-Oat had threatened to slit his throat open from ear to ear. "If you ever frighten me like that again," Major told him, "I'll slit your throat open from ear to ear." Captain Flume gasped and dissolved right back into the patch of dewberry bushes, and Major never set eyes on him again. When Major looked back on what he had accomplished, he was pleased. In the midst of a few foreign acres, teeming with more than 200 people, he had succeeded in becoming a recluse. With a little ingenuity and vision, he had made it all but impossible for anyone in the squadron to talk to him, which was just fine with everyone, he noticed, since no one wanted to talk to him anyway. No one, it turned out, but that madman Yossarian, who brought him down with a flying tackle one day as he was scooting along the bottom of the ditch to his trailer for lunch. The last person in the squadron Major wanted to be brought down with a flying tackle by was Yossarian. There was something inherently disreputable about Yossarian, always carrying on so disgracefully about that dead man in his tent who wasn't even there, and then taking off all his clothes after the Avignon mission and going around without them right up to the day General Dreidel stepped up to pin a medal on him for his heroism over Ferrara and found him standing in formation stark naked. No one in the world had the power to remove the dead man's disorganized effects from Yossarian's tent. Major had forfeited the authority when he permitted Sergeant Towser to report the lieutenant who had been killed over Orvieto less than 2 hours after he arrived in the squadron as never having arrived in the squadron at all. The only one with any right to remove his belongings from Yossarian's tent, it seemed to Major, was Yossarian himself, and Yossarian, it seemed to Major, had no right. Major groaned after Yossarian brought him down with a flying tackle and tried to wiggle to his feet. Yossarian wouldn't let him. "Captain Yossarian," Yossarian said, "requests permission to speak to the Major at once about a matter of life or death." "Let me up, please," Major bid him in a cranky discomfort. "I can't return your salute while I'm lying on my arm." Yossarian released him. They stood up slowly. Yossarian saluted again and repeated his request. "Let's go to my office," Major said. "I don't think this is the best place to talk." "Yes, sir," answered Yossarian. They smacked the gravel from their clothing and walked in constrained silence to the entrance of the orderly room. "Give me a minute or two to put some mercurochrome on these cuts. Then have Sergeant Towser send you in." "Yes, sir." Major strode with dignity to the rear of the orderly room, without glancing at any of the clerks and typists working at the desks and filing cabinets. He let the flap leading to his office fall closed behind him. As soon as he was alone in his office, he raced across the room to the window and jumped outside to dash away. He found Yossarian blocking his path. Yossarian was waiting at attention and saluted again. "Captain Yossarian requests permission to speak to the Major at once about a matter of life or death," he repeated determinedly. "Permission denied," Major snapped. "That won't do it." Major gave in. "All right," he conceded wearily. "I'll talk to you. Please jump inside my office." "After you." They jumped inside the office. Major sat down, and Yossarian moved around in front of his desk and told him that he did not want to fly any more combat missions. What could he do? Major asked himself. All he could do was what he had been instructed to do by Colonel Corn and hope for the best. "Why not?" he asked. "I'm afraid." "That's nothing to be ashamed of," Major counseled him kindly. "We're all afraid." "I'm afraid." "That's nothing to be ashamed of," Major counseled him kindly. "We're all afraid." "I'm not ashamed," Yossarian said. "I'm just afraid." "You wouldn't be normal if you were never afraid. Even the bravest men experience fear. One of the biggest jobs we all face in combat is to overcome our fear." "Oh, come on, Major. Can't we do without that horse shit?" Major lowered his gaze sheepishly and fiddled with his fingers. "What do you want me to tell you? That I've flown enough missions and can go home. How many have you flown?" 51. "You've only got 4 more to fly." "He'll raise them. Every time I get close, he raises them." "Perhaps he won't this time." "He never sends anyone home anyway. He just keeps them around waiting for rotation orders until he doesn't have enough men left for the cruise, and then raises the number of missions and throws them all back on combat status. He's been doing that ever since he got here." "You mustn't blame Colonel Cathcart for any delay with the orders," Major advised. "It's 27th Air Force's responsibility to process the orders promptly once they get them from us." He could still ask for replacements and send us home when the orders did come back. Anyway, I've been told that 27th Air Force wants only 40 missions, and that it's only his own idea to get us to fly 55. I wouldn't know anything about that, Major answered. Colonel Cathcart is our commanding officer, and we must obey him. Why don't you fly the 4 more missions and see what happens? I don't want to. What could you do, Major asked himself again. What could you do with a man who looked you squarely in the eye and said he would rather die than be killed in combat? A man who was at least as mature and intelligent as you were, and who you had to pretend was not. What could you say to him? Suppose we let you pick your missions and fly milk runs, Major said. That way you can fly the 4 missions and not run any risks. I don't want to fly milk runs. I don't want to be in the war anymore. Would you like to see our country lose? Major asked. We won't lose. We've got more men, more money, and more material. There are 10 million men in uniform who could replace me. Some people are getting killed, and a lot more are making money and having fun. Let somebody else get killed. But suppose everybody on our side felt that way. Then I'd certainly be a damned fool to feel any other way, wouldn't I? What could you possibly say to him? Major wondered forlornly. One thing he could not say was that there was nothing he could do. To say there was nothing he could do would suggest he would do something if he could, and imply the existence of an error or injustice in Colonel Corn's policy. Colonel Corn had been most explicit about that. He must never say there was nothing he could do. I'm sorry, he said, but there's nothing I can do. Chapter 10. Wintergreen. Clevenger was dead. That was the basic flaw in his philosophy. 18 planes had let down through a beaming white cloud off the coast of Elba one afternoon on the way back from the weekly milk run to Parma. 17 came out. No trace was ever found of the other, not in the air or on the smooth surface of the jade waters below. There was no debris. Helicopters circled the white cloud till sunset. During the night, the cloud blew away, and in the morning there was no more Clevenger. The disappearance was astounding, as astounding certainly as the grand conspiracy of Lowry Field, when all 64 men in a single barrack vanished one payday and were never heard of again. Until Clevenger was snatched from existence so adroitly, Yossarian had assumed that the men had simply decided unanimously to go AWOL the same day. In fact, he had been so encouraged by what appeared to be a mass desertion from sacred responsibility that he had gone running outside in elation to carry the exciting news to XPFC Wintergreen. What's so exciting about it? XPFC Wintergreen sneered obnoxiously, resting his filthy GI shoe on his spade and lounging back in a surly slouch against the wall of one of the deep square holes it was his military specialty to dig. XPFC Wintergreen was a snide little punk who enjoyed working at cross purposes. Each time he went AWOL, he was caught and sentenced to dig and fill up holes 6 feet deep, wide, and long for a specified length of time. Each time he finished his sentence, he went AWOL again. XPFC Wintergreen accepted his role of digging and filling up holes with all the uncomplaining dedication of a true patriot. It's not a bad life, he would observe philosophically, and I guess somebody has to do it. He had wisdom enough to understand that digging holes in Colorado was not such a bad assignment in wartime. Since the holes were in no great demand, he could dig them and fill them up at a leisurely pace, and he was seldom overworked. On the other hand, he was busted down to buck private each time he was court-martialed. He regretted this loss of rank keenly. It was kind of nice being a PFC, he reminisced yearningly. I had status, you know what I mean? And I used to travel in the best circles. His face darkened with resignation. But that's all behind me now, he guessed. The next time I go over the hill, it will be as a buck private, and I just know it won't be the same. There was no future in digging holes. The job isn't even steady. I lose it each time I finish serving my sentence. Then I have to go over the hill again if I want it back. And I can't even keep doing that. There's a catch. Catch 22. The next time I go over the hill, it will mean the stockade. I don't know what's going to become of me. I might even wind up overseas if I'm not careful. He did not want to keep digging holes for the rest of his life, although he had no objection to doing it as long as there was a war going on and it was a part of the war effort. It's a matter of duty, he observed, and we each have our own to perform. My duty is to keep digging these holes, and I've been doing such a good job of it that I've just been recommended for the Good Conduct Medal. Your duty is to screw around in the cadet school and hope the war ends before you get out. The duty of the men in combat is to win the war, and I just wish they were doing their duty as well as I've been doing mine. It wouldn't be fair if I had to go overseas and do their job, too, would it? One day, ex-PFC Wintergreen struck open a water pipe while digging in one of his holes and almost drowned to death before he was fished out nearly unconscious. Word spread that it was oil, and Chief White Half-Oat was kicked off the base. Soon every man who could find a shovel was outside digging frenziedly for oil. Dirt flew everywhere. The scene was almost like the morning in Pianosa 7 months later after the night Milo bombed the Squadron with every plane he had accumulated in his M&M syndicate, and the airfield, bomb dump, and repair hangars as well, and all the survivors were outside hacking cavernous shelters into the solid ground and roofing them over with sheets of armor plate stolen from the repair sheds at the field, and with tattered squares of waterproof canvas stolen from the side flaps of each other's tents. Chief White Half-Oat was transferred out of Colorado at the first rumor of oil and came to rest finally in Pianosa as a replacement for Lieutenant Coombs, who had gone out on a mission as a guest one day just to see what combat was like and had died over Ferrara in the plane with Kraft. Yossarian felt guilty each time he remembered Kraft, guilty because Kraft had been killed on Yossarian's second bomb run, and guilty because Kraft had got mixed up innocently, also, in the splendid Atabrine insurrection that had begun in Puerto Rico on the first leg of their flight overseas and ended in Pianosa 10 days later with Appleby striding dutifully into the orderly room the moment he arrived to report Yossarian for refusing to take his Atabrine tablets. The sergeant there invited him to be seated. "Thank you, Sergeant, I think I will," said Appleby. "About how long will I have to wait? I've still got a lot to get done today so that I can be fully prepared bright and early tomorrow morning to go into combat the minute they want me to." "Sir? What's that, Sergeant? What was your question?" "About how long will I have to wait before I can go in to see the Major?" "Just until he goes out to lunch," Sergeant Towser replied. "Then you can go right in." "But he won't be there then, will he?" "No, sir. Major won't be back in his office until after lunch." "I see," Appleby decided uncertainly. "I think I'd better come back after lunch, then." Appleby turned from the orderly room in secret confusion. The moment he stepped outside, he thought he saw a tall, dark officer who looked a little like Henry Fonda come jumping out the window of the orderly room tent and go scooting out of sight around the corner. Appleby halted and squeezed his eyes closed. An anxious doubt assailed him. He wondered if he were suffering from malaria, or worse, from an overdose of Atabrine tablets. Appleby had been taking 4 times as many Atabrine tablets as the amount prescribed because he wanted to be 4 times as good a pilot as everyone else. His eyes were still shut when Sergeant Towser tapped him lightly on the shoulder and told him he could go in now if he wanted to, since Major had just gone out. Appleby's confidence returned. "Thank you, Sergeant. Will he be back soon?" "He'll be back right after lunch. Then you'll have to go right out and wait for him in front till he leaves for dinner. Major never sees anyone in his office while he's in his office." "Sergeant, what did you just say?" "I said that Major never sees anyone in his office while he's in his office." Appleby stared at Sergeant Towser intently and attempted a firm tone. "Sergeant, are you trying to make a fool out of me just because I'm new in the squadron and you've been overseas a long time?" "Oh, no, sir," answered the sergeant deferentially. "Those are my orders. You can ask Major when you see him." "That's just what I intend to do, Sergeant. When can I see him?" "Never." Crimson with humiliation, Appleby wrote down his report about Yossarian and the Atabrine tablets on a pad the sergeant offered him, and left quickly, wondering if perhaps Yossarian were not the only man privileged to wear an officer's uniform who was crazy. By the time Colonel Cathcart had raised the number of missions to 55, Sergeant Towser had begun to suspect that perhaps every man who wore a uniform was crazy. Sergeant Towser was lean and angular and had fine blonde hair so light it was almost without color, sunken cheeks, and teeth like large white marshmallows. He ran the squadron and was not happy doing it. Men like Hungry Joe glowered at him with blameful hatred, and Appleby subjected him to vindictive discourtesy now that he had established himself as a hot pilot and a ping-pong player who never lost a point. Sergeant Towser ran the squadron because there was no one else in the squadron to run it. He had no interest in war or advancement. He was interested in shards and Hepplewhite furniture. Almost without realizing it, Sergeant Towser had fallen into the habit of thinking of the dead man in Yossarian's tent in Yossarian's own terms, as a dead man in Yossarian's tent. In reality, he was no such thing. He was simply a replacement pilot who had been killed in combat before he had officially reported for duty. He had stopped at the operations tent to inquire the way to the orderly room tent, and had been sent right into action because so many men had completed the 35 missions required then that Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren were finding it difficult to assemble the number of crews specified by group. Because he had never officially gotten into the squadron, he could never officially be gotten out, and Sergeant Towser sensed that the multiplying communications relating to the poor man would continue reverberating forever. His name was Mudd. To Sergeant Towser, who deplored violence and waste with equal aversion, it seemed like such an abhorrent extravagance to fly Mudd all the way across the ocean, just to have him blown into bits over Orvieto less than 2 hours after he arrived. No one could recall who he was or what he had looked like, least of all Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren, who remembered only that a new officer had shown up at the operations tent just in time to be killed, and who colored uneasily every time the matter of the dead man in Yossarian's tent was mentioned. The only ones who might have seen Mudd, the men in the same plane, had all been blown to bits with him. Yossarian, on the other hand, knew exactly who Mudd was. Mudd was the unknown soldier who had never had a chance, for that was the only thing anyone ever did know about all the unknown soldiers. They never had a chance. They had to be dead. And this dead one was really unknown, even though his belongings still lay in a tumble on the cot in Yossarian's tent, almost exactly as he had left them 3 months earlier, the day he never arrived. All contaminated with death less than 2 hours later, in the same way that all was contaminated with death the very next week during the great big siege of Bologna, when the moldy odor of mortality hung wet in the air with a sulphurous fog, and every man scheduled to fly was already tainted. There was no escaping the mission to Bologna, once Colonel Cathcart had volunteered his group for the ammunition dumps there that the heavy bombers on the Italian mainland had been unable to destroy from their higher altitudes. Each day's delay deepened the awareness and deepened the gloom. The clinging, overpowering conviction of death spread steadily with the continuing rainfall, soaking mordantly into each man's ailing countenance like the corrosive blot of some crawling disease. Everyone smelled of formaldehyde. There was nowhere to turn for help, not even to the medical tent, which had been ordered closed by Colonel Corn so that no one could report for sick call, as the men had done on the one clear day with a mysterious epidemic of diarrhea that had forced still another postponement. With sick call suspended and the door to the medical tent nailed shut, Doc Danica spent the intervals between rain, perched on a high stool, wordlessly absorbing the bleak outbreak of fear with a sorrowing neutrality, roosting like a melancholy buzzard below the ominous hand-lettered sign tacked up on the closed door of the medical tent by Captain Black as a joke, and left hanging there by Doc Danica because it was no joke. The sign was bordered in dark crayon and read, "Closed until further notice, death in the family." The fear flowed everywhere, into Dunbar's squadron, where Dunbar poked his head inquiringly through the entrance of the medical tent there one twilight, and spoke respectfully to the blurred outline of Dr. Stubbs, who was sitting in the dense shadows inside before a bottle of whiskey and a bell jar filled with purified drinking water. "Are you all right?" he asked solicitously. "Terrible," Dr. Stubbs answered. "What are you doing here?" "Sitting. I thought there was no more sick call." "There ain't." "Then why are you sitting here?" "Where else should I sit? At the goddamned officers' club with Colonel Cathcart and Corn? Do you know what I'm doing here?" "Sitting." "In the squadron, I mean. Not in the tent. Don't be such a goddamn wise guy. Can you figure out what a doctor is doing here in the squadron?" "They've got the doors to the medical tents nailed shut in the other squadrons," Dunbar remarked. "If anyone sick walks through my door, I'm going to ground him," Dr. Stubbs vowed. "I don't give a damn what they say." "You can't ground anyone," Dunbar reminded. "Don't you know the orders?" "I'll knock him flat on his ass with an injection and really ground him." Dr. Stubbs laughed with sardonic amusement at the prospect. "They think they can order sick call out of existence, the bastards. Oops, there it goes again. The rain began falling again, first in the trees, then in the mud puddles, then faintly like a soothing murmur on the tent top. Everything's wet, Dr. Stubbs observed with revulsion. Even the latrines and urinals are backing up in protest. The whole goddamn world smells like a charnel house. The silence seemed bottomless when he stopped talking. Night fell. There was a sense of vast isolation. Turn on the light, Dunbar suggested. There is no light. I don't feel like starting my generator. I used to get a big kick out of saving people's lives. Now I wonder what the hell's the point, since they all have to die anyway. Oh, there's a point, all right, Dunbar assured him. Is there? What is the point? The point is to keep them from dying for as long as you can. Yeah, but what's the point, since they all have to die anyway? The trick is not to think about that. Never mind the trick. What the hell's the point? Dunbar pondered in silence for a few moments. Who the hell knows? Dunbar didn't know. Bologna should have exulted Dunbar because the minutes dawdled and the hours dragged like centuries. Instead, it tortured him because he knew he was going to be killed. Do you really want some more codeine? Dr. Stubbs asked. It's for my friend Yossarian. He's sure he's going to be killed. Yossarian? Who the hell is Yossarian? What the hell kind of a name is Yossarian anyway? Isn't he the one who got drunk and started that fight with Colonel Corn at the officers' club the other night? That's right. He's a Syrian. That crazy bastard. He's not so crazy, Dunbar said. He swears he's not going to fly to Bologna. That's just what I mean, Dr. Stubbs answered. That crazy bastard may be the only sane one left. Chapter 11. Captain Black. Corporal Kolodny learned about it first in a phone call from Group, and was so shaken by the news that he crossed the intelligence tent on tiptoe to Captain Black, who was resting drowsily with his bladed shins up on the desk, and relayed the information to him in a shocked whisper. Captain Black brightened immediately. Bologna? He exclaimed with delight. Well, I'll be damned. He broke into loud laughter. Bologna, huh? He laughed again and shook his head in pleasant amazement. Oh, boy, I can't wait to see those bastards' faces when they find out they're going to Bologna. Ha, ha, ha! It was the first really good laugh Captain Black had enjoyed since the day Major outsmarted him and was appointed squadron commander. And he rose with torpid enthusiasm and stationed himself behind the front counter in order to wring the most enjoyment from the occasion when the bombardiers arrived for their map kits. That's right, you bastards. Bologna, he kept repeating to all the bombardiers who inquired incredulously if they were really going to Bologna. Ha ha ha! Eat your livers, you bastards. This time you're really in for it. Captain Black followed the last of them outside to observe with relish the effect of the knowledge upon all the other officers and enlisted men who were assembling with their helmets, parachutes, and flak suits around the 4 trucks idling in the center of the squadron area. He was a tall, narrow, disconsolate man who moved with a crabby listlessness. He shaved his pinched, pale face every 3rd or 4th day, and most of the time he appeared to be growing a reddish-gold mustache over his skinny upper lip. He was not disappointed in the scene outside. There was consternation darkening every expression, and Captain Black yawned deliciously, rubbed the last lethargy from his eyes, and laughed gloatingly each time he told someone else to eat his liver. Bologna turned out to be the most rewarding event in Captain Black's life since the day Major Duluth was killed over Perugia, and he was almost selected to replace him. When word of Major Duluth's death was radioed back to the field, Captain Black responded with a surge of joy. Although he had never really contemplated the possibility before, Captain Black understood at once that he was the logical man to succeed Major Duluth as squadron commander. To begin with, he was the squadron intelligence officer, which meant he was more intelligent than everyone else in the squadron. True, he was not on combat status, as Major Duluth had been, and as all squadron commanders customarily were, but this was really another powerful argument in his favor, since his life was in no danger, and he would be able to fill the post for as long as his country needed him. The more Captain Black thought about it, the more inevitable it seemed. It was merely a matter of dropping the right word in the right place quickly. He hurried back to his office to determine a course of action. Settling back in his swivel chair, his feet up on the desk and his eyes closed, he began imagining how beautiful everything would be once he was squadron commander. While Captain Black was imagining, Colonel Cathcart was acting, and Captain Black was flabbergasted by the speed with which, he concluded, Major Major had outsmarted him. His great dismay at the announcement of Major Major's appointment as squadron commander was tinged with an embittered resentment he made no effort to conceal. When fellow administrative officers expressed astonishment at Colonel Cathcart's choice of Major Major, Captain Black muttered that there was something funny going on. When they speculated on the political value of Major Major's resemblance to Henry Fonda, Captain Black asserted that Major Major really was Henry Fonda, and when they remarked that Major Major was somewhat odd, Captain Black announced that he was a communist. "They're taking over everything," he declared rebelliously. "Well, you fellas can stand around and let them if you want to, but I'm not going to. I'm going to do something about it. From now on, I'm going to make every son of a bitch who comes to my intelligence tent sign a loyalty oath. And I'm not going to let that bastard Major Major sign one even if he wants to." Almost overnight, the glorious loyalty oath crusade was in full flower, and Captain Black was enraptured to discover himself spearheading it. He had really hit on something. All the enlisted men and officers on combat duty had to sign a loyalty oath to get their map cases from the intelligence tent, a second loyalty oath to receive their flak suits and parachutes from the parachute tent, a third loyalty oath for Lieutenant Balkington, the motor vehicle officer, to be allowed to ride from the squadron to the airfield in one of the trucks. Every time they turned around, there was another loyalty oath to be signed. They signed a loyalty oath to get their pay from the finance officer, to obtain their PX supplies, to have their hair cut by the Italian barbers. To Captain Black, every officer who supported his glorious loyalty oath crusade was a competitor, and he planned and plotted 24 hours a day to keep one step ahead. He would stand second to none in his devotion to country. When other officers had followed his urging and introduced loyalty oaths of their own, he went them one better by making every son of a bitch who came to his intelligence tent sign 2 loyalty oaths, then 3, then 4. Then he introduced the Pledge of Allegiance, and after that the Star-Spangled Banner, 1 chorus, 2 choruses, 3 choruses, 4 choruses. Each time Captain Black forged ahead of his competitors, he swung upon them scornfully for their failure to follow his example. Each time they followed his example, he retreated with concern and racked his brain for some new stratagem that would enable him to turn upon them scornfully again. Without realizing how it had come about, the combat men in the squadron discovered themselves dominated by the administrators appointed to serve them. They were bullied, insulted, harassed, and shoved about all day long by one after the other. When they voiced objection, Captain Black replied that people who were loyal would not mind signing all the loyalty oaths they had to. To anyone who questioned the effectiveness of the loyalty oaths, he replied that people who really did owe allegiance to their country would be proud to pledge it as often as he forced them to. And to anyone who questioned the morality, he replied that the Star-Spangled Banner was the greatest piece of music ever composed. The more loyalty oaths a person signed, the more loyal he was. To Captain Black, it was as simple as that, and he had Colonel Kolodny sign hundreds with his name each day so that he could always prove he was more loyal than anyone else. The important thing is to keep them pledging, he explained to his cohorts. It doesn't matter whether they mean it or not. That's why they make little kids pledge allegiance, even before they know what pledge and allegiance mean. To Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren, the glorious loyalty oath crusade was a glorious pain in the ass, since it complicated their task of organizing the crews for each combat mission. Men were tied up all over the squadron, signing, pledging, and singing, and the missions took hours longer to get underway. Effective emergency action became impossible, but Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren were both too timid to raise any outcry against Captain Black, who scrupulously enforced each day the doctrine of continual reaffirmation that he had originated, a doctrine designed to trap all those men who had become disloyal since the last time they had signed a loyalty oath the day before. It was Captain Black who came with the advice to Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren as they pitched about in their bewildering predicament. He came with a delegation and advised them bluntly to make each man sign a loyalty oath before allowing him to fly on a combat mission. Of course, it's up to you, Captain Black pointed out. Nobody's trying to pressure you, but everyone else is making them sign loyalty oaths, and it's going to look mighty funny to the FBI if you two are the only ones who don't care enough about your country to make them sign loyalty oaths, too. If you want to get a bad reputation, that's nobody's business but your own. All we're trying to do is help." Milo was not convinced, and absolutely refused to deprive Major Major of food, even if Major Major was a communist, which Milo secretly doubted. Milo was by nature opposed to any innovation that threatened to disrupt the normal course of affairs. Milo took a firm moral stand and absolutely refused to participate in the glorious loyalty oath crusade until Captain Black called upon him with his delegation and requested him to. "National defense is everybody's job," Captain Black replied to Milo's objection. "And this whole program is voluntary, Milo. Don't forget that. The men don't have to sign Pilchard and Wren's loyalty oath if they don't want to. But we need you to starve them to death if they don't. It's just like Catch-22, don't you get it? You're not against Catch-22, are you?" Doc Danica was adamant. "What makes you so sure Major Major is a communist? You never heard him denying it until we began accusing him, did you? And you don't see him signing any of our loyalty oaths? You aren't letting him sign any." "Of course not," Captain Black explained. "That would defeat the whole purpose of our crusade. Look, you don't have to play ball with us if you don't want to. But what's the point of the rest of us working so hard if you're going to give Major Major medical attention the minute Milo begins starving him to death? I just wonder what they're going to think up at Group about the man who's undermining our whole security program. They'll probably transfer you to the Pacific." Doc Danica surrendered swiftly. "I'll go tell Gus and Wes to do whatever you want them to." Up at Group, Colonel Cathcart had already begun wondering what was going on. "It's that idiot Black, off on a patriotism binge," Colonel Corn reported with a smile. "I think you'd better play ball with him for a while, since you're the one who promoted Major Major to squadron commander." "That was your idea," Colonel Cathcart accused him petulantly. "I never should have let you talk me into it." "And a very good idea it was, too," retorted Colonel Corn, "since it eliminated that superfluous major that's been giving you such an awful black eye as an administrator. Don't worry, this will probably run its course soon. The best thing to do now is send Captain Black a letter of total support and hope he drops dead before he does too much damage." Colonel Corn was struck with a whimsical thought. "I wonder, you don't suppose that imbecile will try to turn Major Major out of his trailer, do you?" "The next thing we've got to do is turn that bastard Major Major out of his trailer," Captain Black decided. "I'd like to turn his wife and kids out into the woods, too, but we can't. He has no wife and kids. So we'll just have to make do with what we have and turn him out. Who's in charge of the tents?" "He is." "You see?" cried Captain Black. "They're taking over everything." "Well, I'm not going to stand for it. I'll take this matter right to Major Blank de Coverley himself if I have to. I'll have Milo speak to him about it the minute he gets back from Rome." Captain Black had boundless faith in the wisdom, power, and justice of Major Blank de Coverley, even though he had never spoken to him before and still found himself without the courage to do so. He deputized Milo to speak to Major Blank de Coverley for him, and stormed about impatiently as he waited for the tall executive officer to return. Along with everyone else in the squadron, he lived in profound awe and reverence of the majestic white-haired major with the craggy face and Jehovian bearing, who came back from Rome finally with an injured eye inside a new celluloid eye patch and smashed his whole glorious crusade to bits with a single stroke. Milo carefully said nothing when Major Blank de Coverley stepped into the mess hall with his fierce and austere dignity the day he returned, and found his way blocked by a wall of officers waiting in line to sign loyalty oaths. At the far end of the food counter, a group of men who had arrived earlier were pledging allegiance to the flag, with trays of food balanced in one hand in order to be allowed to take seats at the table. Already at the tables, a group that had arrived still earlier was singing the Star-Spangled Banner in order that they might use the salt and pepper and ketchup there. The hubbub began to subside slowly as Major Blank de Coverley paused in the doorway with a frown of puzzled disapproval, as though viewing something bizarre. He started forward in a straight line, and the wall of officers before him parted like the Red Sea. Glancing neither left nor right, he strode indomitably up to the steam counter, and in a clear, full-bodied voice that was gruff with age and resonant with ancient eminence and authority said, "Gimme eat." Instead of eat, Corporal Snark gave Major de Coverley a loyalty oath to sign. Major de Coverley swept it away with mighty displeasure the moment he recognized what it was, his good eye flaring up blindingly with fiery disdain, and his enormous old corrugated face darkening in mountainous wrath. "Gimme eat, I said. he ordered loudly in harsh tones that rumbled ominously through the silent tent like claps of distant thunder. Corporal Snark turned pale and began to tremble. He glanced toward Milo pleadingly for guidance. For several terrible seconds there was not a sound. Then Milo nodded. "Give him eat," he said. Corporal Snark began giving Major Blank de Coverley eat. Major Blank de Coverley turned from the counter with his tray full and came to a stop. His eyes fell on the groups of other officers gazing at him in mute appeal, and with righteous belligerence he roared, "Give everybody eat!" "Give everybody eat," Milo echoed with joyful relief, and the glorious loyalty oath crusade came to an end. Captain Black was deeply disillusioned by this treacherous stab in the back from someone in high place upon whom he had relied so confidently for support. Major Blank de Coverley had let him down. "Oh, it doesn't bother me a bit," he responded cheerfully to everyone who came to him with sympathy. "We completed our task. Our purpose was to make everyone we don't like afraid, and to alert people to the danger of Major Major, and we certainly succeeded at that. Since we weren't going to let him sign loyalty oaths anyway, it doesn't really matter whether we have them or not." Seeing everyone in the squadron he didn't like afraid once again throughout the appalling, interminable great big siege of Bologna reminded Captain Black nostalgically of the good old days of his glorious loyalty oath crusade, when he had been a man of real consequence, and when even big shots like Milo Minderbinder, Doc Danica, and Pilchard and Wren had trembled at his approach and groveled at his feet. To prove to newcomers that he really had been a man of consequence once, he still had the letter of commendation he had received from Colonel Cathcart. Chapter 12. Bologna. Actually, it was not Captain Black, but Sergeant Knight who triggered the solemn panic of Bologna, slipping silently off the truck for 2 extra flak suits as soon as he learned the target, and signaling the start of the grim procession back into the parachute tent that degenerated into a frantic stampede, finally, before all the extra flak suits were gone. "Hey, what's going on?" Kid Sampson asked nervously. "Bologna can't be that rough, can it?" Nately, sitting trance-like on the floor of the truck, held his grave young face in both hands and did not answer him. It was Sergeant Knight and the cruel series of postponements, for just as they were climbing up into their planes that first morning, along came a jeep with the news that it was raining in Bologna and that the mission would be delayed. It was raining in Pianosa, too, by the time they returned to the squadron, and they had the rest of that day to stare woodenly at the bomb line on the map under the awning of the intelligence tent and ruminate hypnotically on the fact that there was no escape. The evidence was there vividly in the narrow red ribbon tacked across the mainland. The ground forces in Italy were pinned down 42 insurmountable miles south of the target and could not possibly capture the city in time. Nothing could save the men in Pianosa from the mission to Bologna. They were trapped. Their only hope was that it would never stop raining, and they had no hope because they all knew it would. When it did stop raining in Pianosa, it rained in Bologna. When it stopped raining in Bologna, it began again in Pianosa. If there was no rain at all, there were freakish, inexplicable phenomena like the epidemic of diarrhea or the bomb line that moved. 4 times during the first 6 days they were assembled and briefed and then sent back. Once they took off and were flying in formation when the control tower summoned them down. The more it rained, the worse they suffered. The worse they suffered, the more they prayed that it would continue raining. All through the night, men looked at the sky and were saddened by the stars. All through the day they looked at the bomb line on the big wobbling easel map of Italy that blew over in the wind and was dragged in under the awning of the intelligence tent every time the rain began. The bomb line was a scarlet band of narrow satin ribbon that delineated the forwardmost position of the Allied ground forces in every sector of the Italian mainland. The morning after Hungry Joe's fistfight with Hupple's cat, the rain stopped falling in both places. The landing strip began to dry. It would take a full 24 hours to harden, but the sky remained cloudless. The resentments incubating in each man hatched into hatred. First, they hated the infantrymen on the mainland because they had failed to capture Bologna. Then they began to hate the bomb line itself. For hours, they stared relentlessly at the scarlet ribbon on the map and hated it because it would not move up high enough to encompass the city. When night fell, they congregated in the darkness with flashlights, continuing their macabre vigil at the bomb line in brooding entreaty, as though hoping to move the ribbon up by the collective weight of their sullen prayers. "I really can't believe it," Clevenger exclaimed to Yossarian in a voice rising and falling in protest and wonder. "It's a complete reversion to primitive superstition. They're confusing cause and effect. It makes as much sense as knocking on wood or crossing your fingers. They really believe that we wouldn't have to fly that mission tomorrow if someone would only tiptoe up to the map in the middle of the night and move the bomb line over Bologna. Can you imagine? You and I must be the only rational ones left." In the middle of the night, Yossarian knocked on wood, crossed his fingers, and tiptoed out of his tent to move the bomb line up over Bologna. Corporal Kolodny tiptoed stealthily into Captain Black's tent early the next morning, reached inside the mosquito net, and gently shook the moist shoulder blade he found there until Captain Black opened his eyes. "What are you waking me up for?" whimpered Captain Black. "They've captured Bologna, sir," said Corporal Kolodny. "I thought you'd want to know. Is the mission canceled?" Captain Black tugged himself erect and began scratching his scrawny long thighs methodically. In a little while he dressed and emerged from his tent, squinting, cross, and unshaven. The sky was clear and warm. He peered without emotion at the map. Sure enough, they had captured Bologna. Inside the intelligence tent, Corporal Kolodny was already removing the maps of Bologna from the navigation kits. Captain Black seated himself with a loud yawn, lifted his feet to the top of his desk, and phoned Colonel Corn. "What are you waking me up for?" whimpered Colonel Corn. "They've captured Bologna during the night, sir. Is the mission canceled?" "What are you talking about, Black?" Colonel Corn growled. "Why should the mission be canceled?" "Because they captured Bologna, sir. Isn't the mission canceled?" "Of course the mission is canceled. Do you think we're bombing our own troops now?" "What are you waking me up for?" Colonel Cathcart whimpered to Colonel Corn. "They've captured Bologna," Colonel Corn told him. "I thought you'd want to know." "Who captured Bologna?" "We did." Colonel Cathcart was overjoyed, for he was relieved of the embarrassing commitment to bomb Bologna without blemish to the reputation for valor he had earned by volunteering his men to do it. General Dreedel was pleased with the capture of Bologna, too, although he was angry with Colonel Mudis for waking him up to tell him about it. Headquarters was also pleased, and decided to award a medal to the officer who had captured the city. There was no officer who had captured the city, so they gave the medal to General Peckham instead, because General Peckham was the only officer with sufficient initiative to ask for it. As soon as General Peckham had received his medal, he began asking for increased responsibility. It was General Peckham's opinion that all combat units in the theater should be placed under the jurisdiction of the Special Service Corps, of which General Peckham himself was the commanding officer. If dropping bombs on the enemy was not a special service, he reflected aloud frequently with the martyred smile of sweet reasonableness that was his loyal confederate in every dispute, then he could not help wondering what in the world was. With amiable regret, he declined the offer of a combat post under General Dreedel. "Flying combat missions for General Dreedel is not exactly what I had in mind," he explained indulgently with a smooth laugh. "I was thinking more in terms of replacing General Dreedel, or perhaps of something above General Dreedel, where I could exercise supervision over a great many other generals, too. You see, my most precious abilities are mainly administrative ones. I have a happy facility for getting different people to agree." "He has a happy facility for getting different people to agree what a prick he is," Colonel Cargill confided invidiously to XPFC Wintergreen, in the hope that XPFC Wintergreen would spread the unfavorable report along through 27th Air Force headquarters. "If anyone deserves that combat post, I do. It was even my idea that we ask for the medal." "You really want to go into combat?" XPFC Wintergreen inquired. "Combat?" Colonel Cargill was aghast. "Oh, no, you misunderstand me. Of course I wouldn't actually mind going into combat, but my best abilities are mainly administrative ones. I, too, have a happy facility for getting different people to agree." "He, too, has a happy facility for getting different people to agree what a prick he is," XPFC Wintergreen confided with a laugh to Yossarian after he had come to Pianosa to learn if it was really true about Milo and the Egyptian cotton. "If anyone deserves a promotion, I do. Actually, he had risen already to ex-corporal, having shot through the ranks shortly after his transfer to 27th Air Force Headquarters as a mail clerk, and been busted right down to private for making odious audible comparisons about the commissioned officers for whom he worked. The heady taste of success had infused him further with morality and fired him with ambition for loftier attainments. "Do you want to buy some Zippo lighters?" he asked Yossarian. "They were stolen right from quartermaster." "Does Milo know you're selling cigarette lighters?" "What's it his business? Milo's not carrying cigarette lighters too now, is he?" "He sure is," Yossarian told him, "and his aren't stolen." "That's what you think," ex-PFC Wintergreen answered with a laconic snort. "I'm selling mine for $1 apiece. What's he getting for his?" $1.01. Ex-PFC Wintergreen snickered triumphantly. "I beat him every time," he gloated. "Say, what about all that Egyptian cotton he's stuck with? How much did he buy?" "All." "In the whole world? Well, I'll be damned," ex-PFC Wintergreen crowed with malicious glee. "What a dope! You were in Cairo with him. Why'd you let him do it?" "Me?" Yossarian answered with a shrug. "I have no influence on him. It was those teletype machines they have in all the good restaurants there. Milo had never seen a stock ticker before, and the quotation for Egyptian cotton happened to be going in just as he asked the head waiter to explain it to him. "Egyptian cotton?" Milo said with that look of his. "How much is Egyptian cotton selling for?" The next thing I knew, he had bought the whole goddamn harvest, and now he can't unload any of it. He has no imagination. I can unload plenty of it in the black market if you'll make a deal. Milo knows the black market. There's no demand for cotton. But there is a demand for medical supplies. I can roll the cotton up on wooden toothpicks and peddle them as sterile swabs. Will he sell to me at a good price?" "He won't sell to you at any price," Yossarian answered. "He's pretty sore at you for going into competition with him. In fact, he's pretty sore at everybody for getting diarrhea last weekend and giving his mess hall a bad name." "Say, you can help us," Yossarian suddenly seized his arm. "Couldn't you forge some official orders on that mimeograph machine of yours and get us out of flying to Bologna?" Ex-PFC Wintergreen pulled away slowly with a look of scorn. "Sure I could," he explained with pride, "but I would never dream of doing anything like that.